Okay, so let's talk about Ebonics.
Or as it's more commonly called now, African American English, or AAE for short.
Right, AAE. So this whole thing blew up back in 1996. I
Hmm.
mean, it was everywhere. Headlines, politicians debating it. Even Congress got involved.
Yeah, it really captured the public's attention.
And it seems like everyone had a strong opinion on whether it was legitimate language or just slang.
Right, and what's so interesting to me is how this started with a local school board.
In Oakland, right?
Yeah, they were just trying to find ways to help their students, and it turned into this huge national debate.
About language, but also about race and identity.
Absolutely.
Felt like things got way out of proportion. I mean, blown way out of
Yeah,
proportion.
it definitely did.
So that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Yeah, peel back the layers and look at the facts.
Cut through all the media hype and try to understand what actually happened in Oakland and why it still matters today.
I think if people stick with us, they'll find some surprising insights about language in general.
Yeah, and about bias.
And about how good intentions can get so easily derailed.
Because I remember all the sound bites from back then.
Yo.
Claims that Oakland was trying to teach slang in schools instead of proper English,
Right. Or that it was all a scheme to get more funding.
which just wasn't true.
Not at all. The reality is much more nuanced and, to be honest, pretty disheartening.
So let's set the stage.
Okay.
Oakland, California, 1996.
Right.
The school board, after studying the issue for over a year, they passed this resolution recognizing AAE.
Right.
And their goal was to try to address this persistent achievement gap between black and white students.
And they weren't just making this up.
Yeah.
Other districts had already been experimenting with different ways of teaching.
That took into account how many black children actually spoke,
Exactly. Using AAE as a bridge to standard English.
which makes sense when you think about it. It's
Yeah.
like if you're learning a second language, you build on what you already know.
Right, exactly.
But to understand why this became such a controversial move, we kind of have to go back a bit.
Yeah, we need to understand the prevailing views on language and race back then.
And this is where things get a little disturbing.
Yeah.
Because in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of researchers, they believed in this thing called a cultural deficit model,
Right.
which basically means they thought that black children's speech was somehow deficient.
Yeah, or that it lacked complexity.
Like they weren't capable of forming complex thoughts because of their language.
And that had a huge impact on teaching methods.
Yeah, like black children were constantly corrected.
Right. Their natural way of speaking was basically labeled as wrong.
It's hard to imagine being told as a child that how you speak is wrong.
Right, just because it's different.
Just so
Which
damaging.
is a very damaging approach.
But thankfully, things started to change
Yeah.
in the 70s, thanks to linguists like William Labov.
He did some groundbreaking work,
Yeah, he really did.
observing black children in their natural environments.
And what he found completely debunked that deficit model.
Mm-hmm.
So Labov's work was a turning point then.
It really was. He showed that black children were just as capable of complex language
As anyone else.
as anyone else. They
Yeah.
just weren't being given the space to express it.
In a way that researchers thought was valid.
Exactly.
That's incredible. So what did linguists like Labov learn about AAE? Was it just a different dialect?
Well, they started analyzing AAE as its own language system.
With its own grammar and rules.
Right, and what they found was fascinating.
What was that?
AAE wasn't just bad English, it had its own rich history.
Really?
It evolved from this unique blend of West African languages and English during slavery.
Wow, I never knew that.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Makes you wonder how anyone could have missed such a rich linguistic history.
It's a prime example of how biases can shape our perceptions,
Even in academia.
even in academia.
And this new understanding of AAE led to those new teaching methods.
Yeah.
That Oakland was trying to implement.
Right, the idea was to use AAE as a bridge to standard English.
So you acknowledge the validity of AAE,
Mhm.
but you also help students master the conventions of standard English.
Exactly.
So Oakland seemed to be on the right track. They were using research-backed methods to try to help their students.
They really were.
But then things kind of went off the rails.
They did, and it all came down to a few poorly chosen phrases in their resolution.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they used terms like genetically based
Oh.
and not a dialect of English,
Which I'm guessing were quickly misinterpreted.
and twisted by the media.
Ah, so that's where the firestorm started.
Exactly. Those phrases became fuel for this media frenzy.
And suddenly it wasn't about bridging the achievement gap anymore.
It was about Oakland wanting to teach kids slang.
Instead of proper English.
Right.
And then the public outcry began.
It's amazing how quickly things can spiral out of control.
It really is.
And unfortunately, the Oakland School Board, facing all this backlash, they ended up revising their resolution.
And backing down from their original plan. So a well-intentioned effort to improve education for black students ended up getting crushed under the weight of public opinion.
That's the tragic irony of the Ebonics controversy.
It really is.
It reveals how deeply ingrained these biases about language can be,
And the very real consequences of those biases.
especially for marginalized communities.
Well, this is already eye-opening. I'm definitely curious to learn more about how the media firestorm played out
Yeah.
and what happened in that congressional hearing.
That's coming up next. We'll delve into the media's role in shaping public perception.
And how the Ebonics controversy ultimately impacted education policy.
Exactly. Yeah, the media really play a crucial role in this whole story. It's a classic example of how quickly a narrative can kind of take hold.
And how hard it can be to change course once that misinformation is out there.
Exactly.
So walk us through how the media got it so wrong.
Well, remember that phrase in Oakland's resolution?
About Ebonics being genetically based.
Right. That one. It was actually a linguistic term.
Okay.
It referred to the roots of the language.
In West African traditions.
Right.
So it had nothing to do with genetics in the way that most people would understand it.
Exactly. But the media latched onto that phrase.
Oh, I bet.
And they twisted it to suggest that black children were somehow genetically predisposed to speak this way.
Wow, so a complete misunderstanding of the science.
Yeah, basically. And that misunderstanding it fueled this whole wave of opinion pieces.
Oh, yeah.
And commentaries, many of them just outright racist, criticizing Oakland for supposedly promoting slang.
And undermining standard English.
Right.
Which is so frustrating because, like we discussed, Oakland's goal was to actually improve standard English skills.
Exactly. They just wanted to use a different approach. And then
Right.
there was this whole other idea that they were trying to get more federal funding,
Right, I remember that.
which was another media fabrication.
It took on a life of its own.
It really did. It tapped into these anxieties about black communities, you know.
Taking advantage of the system.
Exactly.
Which is ironic considering that schools are chronically underfunded.
Especially in districts like Oakland.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that even some liberal media outlets kind of jumped on the bandwagon.
Really?
Yeah, they were criticizing Oakland while at the same time saying, oh, but of course nuance is important.
It's like everyone wanted to distance themselves from the school board.
Right, even if it meant perpetuating these harmful stereotypes.
So this wasn't just a right-wing attack then?
No, it was much more widespread.
Wow.
And it even created divisions within the black community itself.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Many prominent black figures spoke out against Oakland.
Huh.
But it's clear that they were reacting to the distorted media narrative, not the actual facts.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for the people in Oakland.
Oh, absolutely.
To have their intentions so completely misconstrued.
And then to be judged by people who weren't even engaging with the real issues.
Yeah, it really speaks to the power dynamics at play.
It does. The voices of linguists, educators, and the Oakland community itself.
They were basically drowned out.
Totally. By the media's sensationalized take on this whole thing.
So what about that congressional hearing? Did that help clarify things at all?
Not really. I mean, it was more of a spectacle than a genuine attempt to understand the complexities of language and education.
Oh, I bet.
You had senators, grandstanding pundits offering simplistic opinions, and the teachers and the experts from Oakland.
They were put on the defensive.
Exactly.
It sounds like a missed opportunity to have a real conversation.
It was a missed opportunity to talk about the achievement gap.
And how to best support black students.
Right.
And in the end, the hearing just reinforced that dominant media narrative.
Yeah. It solidified the idea that Oakland had done something wrong.
Even radical.
Right.
It's amazing how these kinds of misconceptions can become so deeply entrenched.
I know. It's really hard to change people's minds once they've formed an opinion.
Even when there's evidence to the contrary.
Right.
So what was the lasting impact of all this? How did the Ebonics controversy affect education policy moving forward?
Well, the most immediate impact was that Oakland abandoned its plan.
They just gave up.
Pretty much. They revised the resolution and removed any mention of Ebonics.
Or recognizing it as a language.
Right. It was a total retreat in the face of all that pressure.
And a chilling effect, I imagine, for other districts
Oh, absolutely.
who might have been thinking about similar approaches.
The message was clear. If you try to acknowledge the legitimacy of AAE,
You're going to get in trouble.
you'll be met with public outcry and political backlash. So rather than risk that kind of controversy, many schools just stuck with the traditional methods.
Even if those methods weren't really serving their black students.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, it's tragic, really.
Yeah.
A missed opportunity to make real progress.
It is. It's not just about one school district, though.
It's about a broader resistance to acknowledging Black language and Black culture.
You're right. It
Mhm.
taps into these deeply ingrained societal biases. The idea that anything different from standard English.
Is wrong or inferior.
Exactly. Or even a threat. And those biases, unfortunately, continue to affect how we educate children today.
It's disheartening to hear that. So what happened to all the research on AAE and the bridge approach? Did all that progress just come to a halt?
Thankfully, no linguists and educators continue to study AAE, and the evidence supporting the bridge approach, it only grew stronger.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, we'll delve into that and more right after this.
So even after this whole Ebonics controversy and the backlash that came with it, researchers didn't just give up on studying AAE, right?
No, not at all. In fact, you could say they doubled down. They continued studying AAE, and the evidence for the bridge approach, it only got stronger.
So what did they find? What did this research show?
Well, study after study showed that when you acknowledge and incorporate a student's native language, whatever that language may be, it's much more effective than just trying to erase it.
Which makes sense, right? You're building on what the kids already know.
Exactly. Meeting them where they are.
But I imagine the Ebonics controversy created a lot of fear around this.
Oh, absolutely. It made it much harder for teachers to actually use these approaches.
So even though there was evidence that these methods could help students
Teachers were afraid to use them.
because of the potential backlash,
Exactly. They worried about being labeled as radical or unpatriotic.
just for respecting how their students spoke.
It's really sad.
It's like AAE became this taboo topic in the classroom.
Even though it's the language that many of these kids use at home and in their communities.
And that sends a really powerful message to those kids, right?
It does. It tells them that their way of speaking is wrong.
That they need to hide a part of themselves to succeed.
And that can be incredibly damaging to a child's self-esteem.
And their sense of belonging,
Absolutely. It also creates this disconnect between home and school.
making it harder for them to learn.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? How do we move beyond this legacy of the Ebonics controversy? How do we create more inclusive and effective schools for all students?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that AAE is a legitimate language system.
It's not a deficit.
Right. It's not a problem to be fixed. We need to educate ourselves, understand the research, and really challenge any biases that we've internalized.
So we all have a role to play in changing how we think and talk about AAE.
Absolutely. For educators, it means being open to adapting their teaching methods.
To use AAE as a bridge to standard English.
Right, and not doing it because it's politically correct.
But because it actually works.
Exactly, because it's good teaching,
It's about recognizing that language diversity is a strength
not a weakness,
and that all children deserve to feel seen and valued,
for who they are.
including how they speak.
Exactly.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
It's a reminder that the way we talk about language matters,
It really does.
and that even small choices like the words we use can have a huge impact.
On how children learn and how they see themselves.
Well said. And if any of this has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to check out the work of some of the linguists we've mentioned.
Like William Labov and John Rickford.
We'll have links to their work in the show notes.
Their research is fascinating.
And with that, we wrap up another deep dive,
We hope you learned something new today.
and that you'll join us again next time.
For another deep dive into a fascinating topic